32 containers arrived in Iran after 15 days on land. That is where the story begins, because too many people still hear the word railway and think about transportation. This is not mainly a transportation story. It is a control story. It is a story about who gets to decide how trade moves, how sanctions work, how energy is paid for, and which countries are forced to live inside a global system designed by someone else. The real story is not that China quietly built a 10,400-kilometer rail corridor to Iran. The real story is that China is building alternatives to the sea itself. That is a much bigger thing. For decades, American power over the global economy rested on three linked facts. The sea carried the bulk of trade. The dollar settled the bulk of trade, and the United States, together with its allies, had unmatched influence over both the oceans and the financial architecture that moved value across them. You did not need to invade a country to squeeze it. You only needed to make its trade dangerous, its banking difficult, and its access conditional. That is how countries like Iran were supposed to be managed, not with one knockout blow with slow constriction, but constriction only works if there is no good outside route. And that is why the train matters. Because the deeper significance of this railway is not speed. It is that it moves through a zone where Western naval power becomes irrelevant. Deserts do not care about aircraft carriers. Mountain rail corridors do not care about maritime patrol patterns. If you can build enough trade through land routes, the old link between sea power and economic coercion becomes weaker than it used to be. That is the strategic revolution hidden inside. What looks like an infrastructure story to understand why China had to think this way. Start with the fear underneath the project. Malacca, roughly 80% of China's imported oil passes through the Strait of Malacca. That narrow corridor between Malaysia and Indonesia, through which global commerce surges every day for most countries, that is just a shipping fact for China. It is a strategic nightmare, one bottleneck, one lifeline, one passage that sits within a wider maritime system shaped by powers China does not control. This is why serious Chinese planners have spent years asking the same question in different forms. What happens if the sea stops being reliable? What happens if one crisis, one confrontation, or one blockade threat turns the country's greatest commercial artery into a vulnerability? What happens if energy, trade, and industrial life all hang on someone else's maritime dominance? That question has only one serious answer: find another route, not a backup port, not a temporary detour, another route. And that is what makes Iran so important. Iran is not just an oil supplier. It is geography with political meaning. It sits beside Hormuz. It links Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. It is sanctioned enough to need alternatives and important enough to help build them. If China wanted an overland corridor that would matter strategically, Iran was the natural anchor. So the railway was built across China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and into Iran, all the way to the apron dry port near Tehran. 10,400 kilometers, multiple custom systems, different rail gauges, brutal terrain, border frictions, heat that destroys surfaces, sand mountains, and all the ordinary engineering misery that turns a line on a map into a decade of headaches. And yet the line was built. That matters because infrastructure reveals priorities more honestly than speeches do. Governments can bluff with language. They do not usually spend billions of dollars and years of coordination on ideas. They do not consider serious. The effort itself is the proof. Automated bogey exchanges had to be installed to handle track, gauge problems. Critical sections had to be hardened. Parts of the line in Iran were built underground because the route had to survive more than weather. It had to survive war. That single detail tells you everything about how this project was imagined from the start, not as a normal commercial corridor, as a crisis corridor. This was trade planning with sanctions and airstrikes already in mind. That is why I think the source document is strongest when it stops talking like a viral geopolitical thriller and starts talking like a structural analysis, because the core point is true. This railway punches a hole in a system built on control of the oceans, not a giant hole, not one big enough to erase maritime trade, but a real one. And the existence of a real hole matters more than many people think. Power does not collapse when an alternative becomes dominant. Power begins to weaken the moment an alternative becomes credible. That is what this rail link makes possible. Credibility. Credibility for the idea that trade can move through Eurasia without asking the sea for permission. Credibility for the idea that sanctioned countries can still find customers, routes, and payment systems outside the usual Western choke points. Credibility for the idea that the old order is not inevitable, only established. Once credibility arrives, behavior changes, investors think differently, smaller countries think differently, buyers think differently. The threat of isolation becomes less final. And that brings us to the second half of the structure. Money, because moving goods is only half the story. Settling payments is the other half. China has been buying Iranian oil in yuan for years. That sounds technical, but it is one of the most important details in the entire system. The dollar is not just a currency, it is a lever. Energy trade settled in dollars reinforces American reach. Sanctions enforced through dollar channels reinforce American pressure. So every time a major oil relationship is settled in yuan instead, the issue is not only the transaction itself, the issue is the precedent it creates. The railway plus yuan settlement equals something larger than a logistics corridor. It equals a parallel trading architecture. That is the phrase that matters. Parallel architecture, not a replacement for the existing order, at least not yet, but something running alongside it, outside it, and increasingly independent of it. When a buyer, a supplier, a route, and a payment system can all operate without leaning on the old Western controlled framework. The old framework does not disappear. It simply stops being total. That is what is happening here. Iran's role inside that parallel system is obvious. China bought roughly 77% of Iran's crude exports in 2024. The 25-year China-Iran cooperation agreement worth hundreds of billions of dollars is not a symbolic friendship pact. It is an announcement that Iran will not be treated as a temporary sanctions problem, but as a long-term node in a different economic map. And once that map exists, the story grows larger than Iran very quickly, because the next countries watching are not just the big powers. They are the landlocked and the squeezed Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, states whose economic possibilities have always been shaped by who controls their exits. Give them a route through Iran tied into Chinese capital and logistics, and you do more than move cargo. You change orientation. You give them bargaining space. You teach them that their future may not need to run west first. That is why the planned five-nation corridor matters so much. It is not just an expansion. It is a deepening of the same principle. Build enough links across Eurasia, and you do not merely create efficiency. You create political gravity. And in parallel, China and Russia are building the Arctic option, different geography, same civilizational argument. If maritime trade through traditional southern routes remains vulnerable to Western influence, then build a frozen northern path as well. One corridor across the heart of Eurasia, another through the ice, one over land, one over the top of the world, different routes, same ambition, reduced dependence on the old gatekeepers. Now, let us be disciplined here. The railway has hard limits. Rail cannot match the carrying power of supertankers. Border crossings still create friction. Fixed lines can be targeted. Maintenance and punishing terrain is expensive. Even the source text acknowledges that public services seem to stall after major strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure. In other words, no, this is not a clean replacement for the maritime system. But that misses the point. The point is not replacement. The point is redundancy. Redundancy is what weakens coercion. The moment a state or a bloc gains a second viable path, the first path loses some of its old power. Maybe not half, maybe not most, but enough to change calculations, enough to complicate sanctions, enough to reassure trade partners, enough to make total isolation harder, enough to tell Washington that the world it shaped is still powerful, but no longer unchallenged in every domain. And that is what this story means at its deepest level. It means the United States is not simply watching a railway emerge, it is watching the slow construction of a competing theory of world order. An order in which sea control matters less than it once did. An order in which the dollar is not the only trusted energy currency. An order in which sanctioned states can still breathe if Beijing decides to keep the oxygen flowing. An order in which the map of Eurasia becomes more politically important than the maritime map America dominated for generations. That is why this line from China to Iran should not be read as a transport success story. It should be read as a strategic argument, an argument made in steel, loans, tunnels, border stations, and payment systems. An argument that says the world does not have to move through the same gates forever, and if that argument keeps proving itself, one freight train at a time, then the question is no longer whether the old system remains powerful, the question is whether it remains singular, because once a system stops being singular, it stops being absolute, and once it stops being absolute, countries start planning their futures differently. That is what America should really be afraid of. Not the railway itself, the habit it creates, the habit of bypass, the habit of settling outside the dollar, the habit of trading without the sea, the habit of believing that another order can function. That habit, once it spreads, is much harder to sanction than any single cargo train. And that is the real story. Not that China built a railway to Iran, that China is teaching the world how to live with less fear of the routes America once controlled best.